Many of you have asked me to continue reading from the mind and the pen of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident who was such a threat to Soviet tyranny and such a famous heroic figure. The one the Soviets threw out of his own country. They stripped him of his citizenship in 1974. They tried to dishonor his memory and all the work that he'd ever done. He was a writer and a thinker and an intellectual, and of course a Soviet prisoner. Now you can hear me read his farewell letter when he was leaving the Soviet Union in 1974. You can see it in the link below. Now a Soviet plane then at that time flew him out of the Soviet Empire, dropped him in West Germany, and it was from there that he made his way to America in 1978. And once he was on the ground in the land of the free, he was really shocked to find a kind of moral slavery there in our country. There was a high level of apathy in the United States, especially in the young men. And I was, back then, in 1978, I was in school, I was in college. And I remember those days. Young men of my time simply did not have the moral sense to perceive the dangers of creeping socialism in the universities, in the Carter administration at that time, in the public school classrooms, or in the American media. And Solzhenitsyn was really horrified to see that the entire free West was sliding voluntarily toward policies identical to Soviet-style slavery. And he was both shocked and offended by this. Shocked and offended by it. He said this: why is it that societies which have been benumbed for half a century by lies they have been forced to swallow find within themselves a certain lucidity of heart and soul which enables them to see things in their true perspective and to perceive the real meaning of events, whereas societies like America, where he was, with access to every kind of information, suddenly plunge into lethargy, into a kind of voluntary self-deception. And that's what he was asking. His society, which had been benumbed by half a century with lies that they had been forced to swallow, was waking up. But America was voluntarily sliding downward, sliding leftward, sliding into darkness. So self-deceived America was not really quite sure what to make of this hero who came. And while he was there, and as soon as he landed in the United States, of course the KGB quietly followed him everywhere. And they were very worried that his moral leadership might expose the USSR if he simply explained what had been going on over there, what had happened to him when he was in prison, when he was in the gulags. They didn't want him talking. They couldn't kill him because he was so famous. They didn't want to make a martyr of him. So they were following him to see continually to see what was going on, afraid that he would speak about the immoral dictatorship. And then Harvard University issued Solzhenitsyn a formal invitation to speak publicly, and that was just exactly what the KGB had feared, a big high-profile event like that. Because Solzhenitsyn was such a giant of moral clarity, he might say something to inspire American men to wake up from their stupor. And so the KGB was afraid Solzhenitsyn would show these men, this was their second fear, would then first wake them up and then show them how to begin fighting the Soviet socialist agenda in the United States. And so this is why the KGB had a detailed plan, a media campaign that had been years in the making to discredit Solzhenitsyn in America before he could open his mouth publicly, or to swing into effect exactly when he did open his mouth publicly. But then, just before the speech at Harvard, there was a really curious change of plan. And this is a very interesting historic event. Listen to this. The KGB aborted their media campaign. Now, why did they do this? They had been watching the Americans, of course, getting intelligence, not only on Solzhenitsyn and where he went, but also on the Americans and how they were receiving this man. And they discovered that American men were annoyed with men like Solzhenitsyn, with prophets like Solzhenitsyn. And they were truly unwilling to think about moral realities. And I remember those days, and I remember my peers. That's really who we were. We were unwilling to think about that. Soviet intelligence observed that American men were emasculated, gutless infants. That's a really good description of who we were at the time. The American men were intimidated. by feminism, financial discontentment, spiritual confusion, debt slavery, political impotence, social irrelevance. That's exactly who we were. American men had become so weak by 1978 that there was no need to launch a propaganda campaign against a moral hero. American men were blind and lifeless cowards. They were deeply deceived, self-deceived, and they would be insensible to anything important that Solzhenitsyn might say. So this is why the KGB just gave up their plan, aborted it. So they packed up, those agents. They went home, ridiculing and laughing at American men as they went. And they let Solzhenitsyn just get up there in Harvard and say whatever he wanted. And true to form, what he wanted to say was true and moral and convicting. He said America suffered, look at some of these statements that he made. He said America suffered a decline in courage and a lack of manliness. And he knew what he said, and people knew he meant what he said and knew how he was defining manliness. He said Americans were offending God. He said the human soul longs for things higher and warmer and purer than TV stupor and intolerable music. And that's what Americans were becoming, addicted to those things. Now here's another truth bomb. I mean, even in bringing up the topic of morality and evil and the soul, he was uncovering things that Americans had been unwilling to think about and talk about, especially at Harvard, and he was saying them. Here's another truth bomb. He said socialism of any type and any type and shade leads to a total destruction of the human spirit and to a leveling of mankind into death. And that's what he knew from the Soviet Union. That's what he had seen happen to all the Soviet satellite countries. So Solzhenitsyn there at Harvard could see right into the distorted souls of American men. And it was clear to him that they had forgotten what manliness was and had no interest in finding out what it was. But he spoke up anyway, knowing that some of us someday might pay attention. And that's why I'm making this video. So listen now to these quotes that I want to give you from his speech. This is not the whole speech, but these are just some of the quotes that I want you to hear and think about. And think about friends that you know who might need to hear these. He said this: a decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, each government, each political party, and of course in the United Nations. So he's talking about the entire West now. It's not just unique to the United States. The entire West is falling prey to these things. And then he talks about his country and what he has learned. Through intense suffering, our country, meaning the Soviet Union, has now achieved a spiritual development of such intensity that the Western system in its present state of spiritual exhaustion does not look attractive. So people would ask him when he was there in the United States, hey, wouldn't you just love to make your home here in the United States and live here in the land of the free and the home of the brave? And he's saying, well, you know, I don't know if I want to. You're becoming so dead and listless. You have no character. Why would I want to live in a country like that? And that's what he's addressing right here in his speech. It doesn't look attractive to want to live in the West at this point. Even those characteristics of your life which I have just mentioned are extremely saddening, he says. There is a weakening of human beings in the West, while in the East, meaning in the Soviet Union, they are becoming firmer and stronger. 60 years for our people. During that time, we have been through a spiritual training far in advance of Western experience. So he said, in the last 60 years, what we've been through, it's been a kind of spiritual training to make us tougher and stronger and more courageous. Where, look, what's happened to you? You're becoming dead and cowardly. He says, life's complexity and moral weight have produced stronger, deeper, and more interesting characters. And what he means by that is the internal character of the mind and the soul and the heart. More interesting characters than those generally produced by standardized Western well-being. And yes, of course he can acknowledge, look, you've got electricity, You've got clean water, you've got sewers and things. You have medicine, you have dentistry, you have better nutrition. It's Western well-being materially, but what's happening to you spiritually? And then he brings this up. The forces of evil have begun their offensive. And he said, because you're so weak and you don't have any perimeter of courage and bravery, evil is closing in on you. The forces of evil have begun their offensive. And in his whole speech, and of course I'm not reading the whole thing, I'm just reading him just a few quotes from this. He brings up the concept of evil and saying one of the reasons why you're declining and you're falling and you're failing is because of evil coming in on you, taking over your country, taking over your political systems, making your bureaucracy more tyrannical. And the free people of America are going to become slaves very soon. That's what he was pointing out in 1978. So what you need to realize is the kind of tyranny that you all are experiencing right now in the United States. It just didn't happen with the most recent inauguration. It's been going on since the 1960s, at least. I mean, really, it's been, if we dig into history, and if you look at some of my videos, you'll see where I take you back in history and show how some of the foundations for surrender were laid, even in the 1920s, the 1930s, through the proliferation of a government school system, a forced government school system. And there are evils involved in that. Lack of freedom, lack of academic freedom. Saying the forces of evil have begun their offensive. You can feel their pressure, and yet your screens and publications, TV screens and your films, are full of prescribed smiles and raised glasses. What is the joy about, he's saying? You know, what's all the joy about? You know, you're celebrating what? Very well-known representatives of your society, such as George Kennan, he was a diplomat at the State Department, and quite famous and being quoted by Time magazine, etc., say, we cannot apply moral criteria to politics. A lot of people were saying that. We cannot apply moral criteria to politics. It's different, you know, separation of church and state and other excuses which were non-historical and not true. Thus, we mix, when we say that, we mix good and evil, right and wrong, and make space for the absolute triumph of absolute evil in the world. And now, in the 21st century, what he has predicted is coming true in your country. It's coming true right now, every single day. Absolute evil and the triumph, the absolute triumph of it, where all your freedom will be gone. On the contrary, he says, only moral criteria can help the West against communism's well-planned world strategy, which has never faded, even after the decline and fall of the so-called Soviet Union in 1989. That's why it's still alive. It never ended on the university campuses of the United States or in the swamp of the United States, the State Department, or in the deep state of the United States. Never did end. He says there are no other criteria than moral criteria. Practical or occasional considerations of any kind will inevitably be swept away by strategy. And after a certain level of the problem has been reached, legalistic thinking induces paralysis. And that's what he means. If we don't know how to think about right and wrong and what lies at the bottom of our Constitution, we'll get everything mixed up in our Constitution. Like right now, the Commerce Clause. Does that really give the CDC the freedom to come in and have police powers and force you to do whatever they say? That's not what the founders wanted. That's not how they understood freedom. That's not how they understood the separation of powers. And this is what he's getting at. You can't just say, oh, we have the Constitution, we'll be fine. No, if the courts are twisting it, and the law schools are twisting, and the public education system is twisting it, and the meaning of it, and the morality behind it, and stripped all that away, the body of the Constitution cannot save the United States. That's the point he's making. To Harvard, 1978. It prevents one from seeing the size and meaning of events. You won't be able to see and grasp the real nature of the evil and how complete and total it really can be. Next, he says, to defend oneself, one must also be ready to die. Are you willing to defend what you have and what you've inherited, your legacy and your inheritance? If you're not even willing to die for that, you can't defend your civilization. To defend oneself, meaning your society and your country and your heritage, one must also be ready to die. There is little such readiness in a society raised in the cult of material well-being. And that's what he saw when he got here. That's really what we were living for. And that was it. How can I do better than I did last year? Materially. Never thinking about the spiritual realities of evil and good and eternity and the soul, which are ideas that he brought up in his speech. And then he says this, in keeping silent about evil, not talking about it, not even acknowledging that it exists, in burying it so deep within us that no sign of it appears on the surface. And that's kind of what you can do in America. You can go about life looking like you're a pretty good law-abiding person, but really be driven by many different forms of incredible evil, habitual evil, being enslaved to evil in the way that we think, the things that we lust after and want, and will commit crimes to get what we want, and hurt people, and walk all over people to get what we want. We can become people like that, and we are becoming people like that. No sign of that evil appears on the surface, but we are implanting it, and it will rise up 1,000-fold in the future in our institutions and in ourselves personally. When we neither punish nor reproach evildoers, like what happened just in 2020 with all the rioting, and then all the local district attorneys who said, we're not even going to punish those people, or reprove them, or reproach them, or correct them. We will actually celebrate them and what they're doing. When we neither punish nor reproach evildoers, we are not simply protecting their trivial old age. We are thereby ripping the foundations of justice from beneath new generations. That's exactly what we did. And he was right. And he was like a prophet. I'm not saying that he had extra biblical revelation coming to him to speak, but he could just see the lay of the land, good and evil, from what he had been through. He had seen the face of evil in the Soviet Union. And so those are some of the wisdom of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His words have an urgency to them now. So let me close by just saying this. How many Americans are willing now to listen to him? How many? I'm Jeffrey Botkin. If you think you know Americans who need to hear this, please do share it and get notifications, and then watch this next.